Thank you for everybody who is watching this video. My name is Evan Seelig, and I am the manager of digital communications at the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences. And today we have the pleasure of talking to the hosts of the Actor's Mind podcast. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have Ann Penner, who is the Associate Professor of Theater and is also an actor, director, and producer. And then down on the bottom, we have Kateri McRae, who is an Associate Professor of Psychology, and she also is an actor. So to start out, you go into this a little bit in episode 1, but for everybody who joined us just starting in with this episode, I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how this podcast got started.
Thank you, Evan. Thank you so much for letting us do this. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to do this. So Kateri, I guess I'll start, but I gave a lecture in January of 2017 that discussed 20th century actor training, 20th and 21st century actor training. And Kateri graciously was in the audience and was taking notes. You want to take over, Kateri?
Yeah, I mean, I found myself actually pretty furiously taking notes, not in the way that you do sometimes because you don't want to forget things or because things are brand new to you, but because I was starting to see all these connections. And a lot of my notes had like equal signs in the middle, right? It'd be like, oh, Anne talked about like this, that equals this in psychology. And so I was really like kind of bridging like terminology really between acting and psychology. So I was like, I couldn't type fast enough to like keep up with the thoughts that were going in my head. And this is a recurring theme when Anne and I kind of get going, is like, we're like, oh, no, like, there's too many ideas. And I had met Anne previously, but I reached out after the lecture and just offered to sort of grab a cup of coffee, and like, I didn't really have an agenda of like something I wanted to get out of the meeting. I just was like, I had all these thoughts in response to your lecture. Like, do you want to hear these thoughts? And she said, yeah. And we started having coffee, like, I don't know, once a month, maybe?
Yeah. Or possibly ultimately more often than that. And we just started talking and shooting ideas between ourselves. And it was very sparky. Do we say called sparky?
Totally sparky.
Sparkiness.
It was like mutually sparky and then like, incendiary, I guess.
Yeah. And what was joyful was there was no agenda, at least for the first several months. And we just would talk. And then I think I was the one who said, offhand, let's turn this into a podcast, because I'm a fan of many, many podcasts and find them really enjoyable to listen to, whether I'm working out or driving. And so we started to kind of work with that idea, and we continued to talk all through 2017. And in the fall of 2017, and thanks to some a DU grant, we were able to actually begin to execute it. And we started recording in the beginning of 2018.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really fun. I think one of the most fun things about listening to your podcast is that it feels like you're listening in on two good friends having a conversation. I think right now that's really, really salient and something that a lot of us are missing out on. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
One thing that we did in starting this, I allowed you to choose which episode you wanted to promote. And so I wanted to ask you, what was it about this topic, substitution and episodic memory, that was so exciting to you, and why did you choose this episode?
I am proud of all of our episodes for different reasons. And a few of them, maybe 4 or 5 of them, stand out as ones I'm especially proud of. And this was one of them, where I feel like both Kateri and I and our guest are relatively clear, succeed in being clear about the topics that we're discussing. And this one in particular, substitution, is an acting tool that, as I teach it, and especially as we built this episode 2 years ago, I learned more about. So I think there's a lot of different ways to understand substitution. I feel like how I used to understand it even just a few years ago was more superficial than I now understand it. And then I really enjoyed our interview also with our guest, Gareth.
For me, it's so interesting because we agreed like pretty quickly, like we kind of like narrowed it down pretty quickly, but we actually didn't discuss why. We just were like, yeah, that's a good
Yeah, that one.
so this is like the first time I'm hearing Anne's answer. I love it. For me, a lot of psychological research is there was like some interesting ideas about distinctions between things and all that, but like the memory, like understanding memory is one of the relatively better understood things. I mean, memory is super vast and deep and complicated, and like I'm sure a memory researcher would like laugh to hear me say that it's like relatively well understood, but like there's fairly clear rules about how the brain, you know, sort of like processes certain things. And I felt like the distinctions that I could at least like explain clearly mapped on really well to the sorts of things that Anne was talking about. So to me, it felt like a little bit more like the science actually had some things were like crisp and scientific to add, rather than just like a few concepts that were like interesting to toss around, which sometimes happens, which is also fun and interesting, but a little bit less like your brain does this and not that, and therefore like you should do this and not that in an acting class. And then Anna was like,
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, wonderful. So I'm guessing the answer to this is yes, but were there any things that you wish you had time to cover and didn't have time to cover in the episode, or that you felt like you touched on the surface but were just itching to go further into?
Oh, that's a great question. I feel like is loquacious a word? What's a word when you just talk a lot? It's hard for us. You know, we used to be like, we got to keep them to 60 minutes. Like we'll talk for 30 and the guests will talk for 30. And we've had a really hard time with that. So my answer to that is, for the most part, I get out almost everything I want to say. We do end up editing a few things out. But if I had to, I think here's one thing. I feel like as we're recording the podcast, kind of like we're doing right now, I am doing my best to listen 100% to Kateri. And I am listening well. I think it's impossible to fully 100% understand 100% of what she's saying, 100% of what she's saying, partly because I'm thinking about like our levels and making sure that we're moving the outline along. So what's joyful is I just re-listened to the episode this morning, is every time I re-listen, I get closer to 100% of understanding Kateri. So that's less about wishing there was something else in there than just like, I think it's chock full of a lot of cool stuff that if you listen a second or third time, at least from my experience, I'll get even more.
Great.
I feel like, and it's funny, and you should, as you were talking about listening, I literally have the episode outline, our notes for it up.
Great.
So I was like, ooh, what did we make notes about that we didn't actually put in the episode? But Anne's talking about how well she's listening, and I'm like looking over at my notes. I totally agree that like you get more, you know, as you sort of re-listen, and I think we are both, you know, loquacious and very productive in our words, but I think we're also, you know, I think both you and I are like relatively quick thinkers, and we tend to like put out ideas at like a relatively quick pace. So I think that a lot of times, like within a minute, you know, you'll say three things, and I only have time to respond to one of them. So that happens a lot. In terms of this particular episode, I feel like most of the stuff that we maybe didn't spend as much time as we wanted to in the episode, we got back to in other episodes, because this is so early on. You know, I know Anne is really interested in the difference between, we both are really interested in the difference between like actual lived experience that people have had and like situations that are just really similar, and like what the boundaries are in terms of their usefulness as an acting tool. And we got into that a lot in season 2. I feel like, and I think we probably could have talked a little bit more about imagination. Maybe some of that we touch on in the in an upcoming episode on creativity. You know, that comes out a little bit. And then there was like one other, go ahead, Anne.
Can I hop in about imagination?
Yeah.
I think you and I maybe could have talked more about that. I think Gareth, our guest on the substitution episode, tackled that really beautifully. I think a trap that we fall into with substitution that we talk about is that we think this imaginative substitution or the substitution that we're pulling from our real life has to all have happened, that the people in my substitution and the given circumstance of my substitution all are real. And you know, before talking to Gareth, we said, that doesn't have to happen. We just need some portion of our real life. But he really went crazy with that, where he's like, well, yeah, I start with an aspect of my real life, and then as quickly as possible, I make it imaginative. So that was, I thought that another reason this is one of my favorite episodes is I felt like I was really enjoyed what Kateri and I talked about. And then I thought the Gareth conversation amplified the conversation even more.
Yeah. Great. Kateri, did you want to add anything more on that, or did you get most of the way through?
I did, but I forget what it is. Hold on just one second. I feel like there was like one other thing that we wanted to talk about a little bit more that we didn't. I mean, the other thing, this isn't anyway, is we almost always have more examples than we have time to get to. Like Anne has had so much experience as an actor, as a director, and we frequently, as we're planning the episodes, we bond over productions that we've seen, or we really like telling each other stories of productions we've seen where something worked really well or something was like on display. So I don't have all of those written down, but I often, like when we push the stop button on recording, I often feel like, oh, I had 3 more examples of like this show I did in college and this play I saw on Broadway 3 years ago and like this local production that I think Anne's friend was in. Like, you know, we usually are not at a loss for like really concrete examples of things going on like on stage.
Yeah, and to add to that and to support that is we're really, one of our main priorities is to keep that sparkiness. So Evan, thank you for saying, you know, that it felt like you're listening in on Friends, because that is one of our goals. And we don't want, we do of course have an outline, and we have ideas and conversations planned to some extent, but of course it's not verbatim. And so we're hoping, as Kateri is saying, that some of this really spontaneity will be, the hot takes will be inside of the podcast. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So you mentioned your guest, Gareth Sachs, and I wanted to ask you all, why did you choose him for this particular episode and topic?
Should I answer that? I'll start.
You definitely should.
He's a friend of mine. He's a good friend of mine. I count him among one of my closest friends. I had met him a few months earlier because he had moved back to Denver, and we had a good mutual friend from New York who was like, you have to, make sure you see Gareth because he's moved back there. And he along with Kateri and a couple other people near and dear to me, we kind of nerd out about theater. Like he's one of my favorite people to just kind of talk shop about and talk about ideas and talk about the experience of acting. And he's had a ton of experience. And I, as Kateri and I have said many times, there are other kinds of actors, meaning there are excellent actors who actually aren't that interested in talking about the process of acting. And so when we think about the guests we want to bring on, whether they're theater professionals or scientists or psychologists, we want them to be willing to kind of unpack the ideas rather than just be like, whatever, it's easy, I just do it. Gareth,
just to underscore that, there are some amazing performers who just don't introspect that much about it, who don't like think about their process, and like maybe they believe, and maybe they're right, that if they thought too much about it, it would like kind of ruin it, like, and it wouldn't like work for them anymore. But it's like this weird, a lot of times we throw out like 3 or 4 different names for guests, and we're like, who would really also join in this sort of like, yeah, I thought about that, and actually maybe it's like this. Like that's the kind of guest we are, other than someone's like, I don't know, I just do it. I'm just kind of, I've always been kind of good at it, so I keep doing it.
And I think I'd had a conversation about substitution with him within the month prior, so it felt fitting.
Yeah, that's great.
So he has a really nice voice.
He's got a great voice.
That is so true. Yes. So one of the things that he brought up in his interview was that there isn't any freedom without structure. And that really stuck out to me when I was listening to it this week, just because we're in a time where in some ways there's an overabundance of structure, and then in other ways there's just a complete lack of it. And I wonder how that's affecting both your art and your academics right now.
Well, Evan, thank you for the perfect lead into the start of season 3. So we're actually in our very first episode, we as far as podcasts go, we are relatively deliberative about this podcast. We plan out like a whole year at a time. We record 5 episodes in a year, and we release them slowly. Like this is not like a, every other day, getting on a chat and releasing a podcast kind of podcast. And so we had a plan for all of season 3. And then of course we were, not quite halfway through executing it when the shutdown happened in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So we pivoted, and our very last episode that we recorded is going to be the first one we release. And it's going to be about the impact of the pandemic on and teaching of acting in particular. Like, how do you connect with students that you've always taught in person remotely, as well as like a little bit touching on the impact of it on theater companies and like the art of theater and the business of keeping theater going when it's inherently a in-person synchronous less than 6 feet apart event. So the long answer to your question is stay tuned for that episode. But in terms of your like really specific observation of like what Gareth said, you know, it's hard. I have more constraints on my time now than I did before. I have a young kid at home. And she's pretty great. You know, I'm actually able to get like more stuff done than I might have imagined. But like just the sheer number of hours I have is fewer because we don't have childcare for her. And I'm definitely not getting more done like in terms of raw volume, but I'm really efficient and careful about like what I spend my time on and what I say yes to. And so I feel like, you know, structure causes people to adapt, right? Like if you put a barrier in place, then people have to be more intentional about how they form themselves around that barrier. And so I think that's happening. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the structure that we have right now, or the lack of structure maybe, is like a lot of it is unpredictable, you know. We've tried really hard to maintain some semblance of routine. So at least I know when I wake up in the morning, like roughly how many hours I have to get some work done. It's a lot fewer than it used to be, but at least I'm like, I know I've got this 2.5 hour, you know, chunk, because that's what I've negotiated with my family. And some people don't have that kind of predictability. And then it's like just a lot more anxiety provoking, because it's like, you know, waking up in the morning and be like, I have no idea if I'll have 1 hour or 8 hours or 2 hours, or, you know, that's really rough.
One thing I'm driving home with my students, one class is called Theater Imagination, and it's a 1,000-level course on creativity and storytelling, where the students are tasked with building small creative projects every week and really sort of assessing and evaluating their creative process and their creative habit and routine. And then the other is movement and voice training for actors, which is challenging to do online, but we're doing it. And a lot of it has to do, it becomes far less collaborative, and it's a lot more about how an individual student, actor, performer can build a routine, a ritual, a practice, a training practice for both a physical practice and a vocal practice. And then the students are dealing with circumstances of there's more mental health issues, there's more depression because of what's going on. Definitely, even though it feels like it's been forever, it's still new enough that I think we're all still figuring out how we feel, and as Kateri said, how we find routine. And some of them are struggling to feel motivated and focused. Some seem to really flourish in this idea of the challenge of finding ritual as a creative person or as an actor, and some people are struggling. For sure. And then the one other thing I want to say about structure versus freedom and this will pop up in our 3rd episode of season 3, which is on creativity, for which we have this amazing guest named Anne Bogart, who's a world-renowned theater director and teacher. Is when I think when an actor's building a character, or a group of collaborators are building a show, they are tasked with creating the world of that character, or the world of the play, and that world is bounded. It's not everything, right? It's not like every possible ingredient at your fingertips should be in this world of the character of the play. So you have to find a structure where you're like, yes, that's an essential element. No, we don't need that. And by creating that structure, there's then freedom to play, because you're like, okay, I know what ingredients I have, right? I have my spaghetti, I have my tomato sauce, I have basil, and I have garlic. I know what to make, right? But if it's too disparate, if there isn't enough structure and enough choice, then you can feel kind of crazy.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to play a little clip from the episode. And in this clip, Kateri had just asked Anne whether she finds herself tagging experiences in her everyday life to use later.
It's not that I go, oh, tag it, like I'm going to use this when I work on Queen Margaret. Like, well, no, I do that too, actually. When I'm inside an experience that's very emotional, that feels significant, that feels hot, right? That feels important. I am experiencing it subjectively. I'm experiencing it in the present subjectively. And I am also experiencing it objectively, like a teacher, student, actor. Wow. And that's weird.
That is weird.
But it also is useful. I love that question. I need to come up with questions for you. It's also useful then to allow the subjective experience to be okay. Yeah. It's as if my relationship, maybe this is just because I'm getting older, my relationship to the subjective, intense emotional experience has a little bit of objectivity, which is, this is valuable, this is important. Yeah. Don't push this down, don't make it go away before it needs to.
Yeah.
I feel, Evan, thank you. Kateri, don't you feel so fancy having the podcast play?
Yes. A, I feel fancy. B, I don't feel like that much time has passed, but I feel like that was so long ago.
I know.
Sorry, did you have a specific question, Evan, or can I jump in with my reaction?
Go ahead and jump in,
That was such a timely clip to play right now, because I feel like so much of the brief, meme-sized mental health advice that's circulating through social media right now about how to deal with the pandemic is letting people feel their feelings, right? Telling people that their feelings are valid. It's okay that you're not okay. This is hard. There's I've seen some memes going around that's let's everybody keep in mind, this is a traumatic experience. All of us are fearing for our lives and for normalcy and for our pocketbooks and all of these sorts of things. And so I feel one of the, Anne was kind of saying, one of the things that gives her permission to sit in her own emotions is the feeling that this is useful somehow. And I feel like that just, even though it's for a different reason, right? There's not a lot of people at home being oh, if I'm ever going to play, I can use this feeling that I had, when I was trapped in my house. But just that, it's okay that you're feeling this way. You don't have to fight it, even if it's an unpleasant feeling. You don't have to make it go away as quickly as possible, which is an emotion regulation sort of technique called acceptance, to accept your own emotions that you're having. It's just really, I found that to have new meaning for you to play it right now.
Yeah, thank you. I totally agree.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm wondering if there are other aspects of acting or psychology that you're using in this time, or that you're finding are even more relevant than before.
Ooh, I want to hear from Anne.
Oh God, I love that. Can I respond briefly to the portion you played?
Yeah, absolutely.
I just love this relationship between objectivity and subjectivity. And one thing that's joyful and challenging about teaching performance is my response to it as the teacher is so subjective. And I'm constantly, in a good way, sort of questioning, why am I really enjoying that person's performance? Is it because they're doing good work, or I just kind of like them as a human being? And why am I frustrated with that? Is because they're doing bad, objectively doing poor work? Or did they just say something at the start of class that frustrated me? But that it is my job to some extent to objectify, whether it's to create a rubric or a list of criteria to say this is, and this has actually just happened this past week or two in one of my classes, is to be able to objectively say, I am assessing you on these 4 or 5 criteria while I look at your work. Because I think it makes students, especially in this time, feel safer and feel sort of regardless of the work that you're assessing them in. But I think it is a thing that as an acting teacher, I could always get better at. And I think there's more. Going back to your very first question, do you wish there was more that we talked about? Kateri, future episode, objectivity, subjectivity.
I'll write it down right now.
That fascinates me.
Season 4.
Yeah, what am I doing now? Well, it's an excellent question, and I don't have a concise answer. But I think inherent in acting is the fact that you are using yourself to tell the story. You are using breath, you are using your body, you are using relaxation, tension, you are using your voice, you are using words. And there's a catharsis, there's a potential that in the making of it, in the me producing this character or this part of the story, that I can feel catharsis and I can feel empathy. And I think for an audience member, the idea of witnessing that story, especially when we're feeling, as Kateri said, to greater or lesser extents traumatized by what's going on, that to watch an actor perform a thing, there's an opportunity to empathize, to relate, to say like, I get that. And to, I guess catharsis means to purge, to kind of cleanse yourself of some of this anxiety. It's happened to me, like I'm watching more movies these days and more television. And I was just watching, I watched the end. Oh my God. I watched the end of The Good Place with my children. No, mostly my son who's older. My daughter doesn't watch much, but like the end, I was sobbing.
Yes.
Yeah. I was just crying and crying. It's a beautiful, beautiful ending. And my kids are like, are you okay? Like what? I was like, it's just good crying. This is good crying. I cried at the end of Wonder, the movie. But for the same reason, it's like I'm a little more anxious than usual. And then I get to see these stories that have these happy or satisfying or beautiful endings. And you're just like, and as I mentioned to Kateri, I've done exercises with the movement in voice where I've asked students to physically express sensation. And the sensation could be a physical sensation, like I'm hungry, or an emotional sensation, like I feel really sad, or just a cognitive sensation, like, oh my God, I just figured that out. And then to physicalize it. And some of them did say, yeah, that felt cathartic to express it.
Great.
Can I ask you another question, Anne?
Yeah.
So a few weeks ago, one of our guests from season 2, who was our guest for the criticism episode, John Moore, posted on Facebook a sort of joke where he was like, am I allowed to say that I'm not looking forward to all of the plays that are going to be written in the next few years about what goes on in spring of 2020? And he very much meant it as a joke. But it did, he was the first person to point out to me. I was like, oh, there are going to be a lot of plays about this, right? Like, and it's a slow trickle. Like I saw a play at the Humana Festival in 2018, 19, I can't remember when I was there. That was about 9/11, and that took several years to get out. So this is such a weird question, but are you tagging anything mentally for like, what if I'm in a play about this in like 3 years or 5 years, or what if I direct a play about
That's
this?
funny because my husband just today, we have Kaiser Permanente health insurance. He's like, now Kaiser's telling us to keep a journal. And I was like a journal for like, if we start to feel sick. He's like, no, I think like a mental health journal. I was like, I'm not going to do that. I have thought
like a journaly person. I'm surprised.
Me, well, I think that's part of my answer, which is I do occasionally keep a journal, and I've been meaning to, but I'm less inclined right now. I feel so inside of it that I am not really interested in writing about it. And I'm not right now interested in seeing stories. This might change. It probably will change, that are explicitly, literally about coronavirus, the quarantine. However, I do think metaphor comes into play. Like, I do think allegory, like there's a lot of apocalyptic plays out there. And as far as I know, we have not yet had an apocalypse. And I think when it is when it is expressive, when it's not literal, like it's not about Ann Penner in April 2020 in Denver, Colorado, when it's more allegorical and metaphorical and expressive, it's a thing I could get interested in. Like, there's this famous Brecht play that we're working on with our juniors called Mother Courage. And it's set it's a Brecht, it's an anti-war play. And he was anti-Nazi and anti-World War II. It came out right before World War II, but it takes place in the 100 Years' War in like the 1600s. Or I just read, a scientist sent me a thing about King Lear. And that King Lear, Shakespeare wrote it during the plague, which I didn't know because I'm not a historian. And like the storm, there's a lot of kind of plague allegorical language, and the storm, I interpreted what I read as like, oh, the storm is the allegory for the plague, but it's a storm. It's not the plague. So that kind of stuff interests me. So, but no, I don't think I've been pinning things. What I have been doing a lot of is feeling very strong emotions and practicing, like you said, the subjective to objective, like it's okay. Like this, like marking it as like not out of control, like this feeling of feeling totally overwhelmed is not out of my control. It's actually very normal, and it's a very reasonable response to what's going on. I've been doing a lot of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if you two have also been doing that. Have you?
I have. Yeah, I've also been wrestling with giving myself permission to not feel gratitude all of the time. Like I have this like devil on my shoulder that's like, you should be grateful. Like you still have a job. Like, you have, a yard your dogs can go out in, like, all of the sort of comparative things. You can afford to stock up your house with groceries, like that sort of thing. And I'm like, that doesn't always make you feel like you're overflowing with joy at the situation. Like it's good to keep that in perspective. It's good to have that to spur action to say, okay, what can I do? Because I'm in that position to help other people who are not in that position. And it's okay to, and it's okay to use that to cultivate gratitude around, I find like really small things that I've never been grateful for before, I'm like really grateful for. But that doesn't mean, like, just because you have things to be grateful for doesn't mean you need to be like happy all the time.
No, I do think, to respond to that gratitude, when I do feel grateful for a thing, whether it's big or small, I do mark it as like, let's hang out with this for a bit longer. Like I need to hold on to this and stick it in the bank so that when I don't feel this way, I can feel that one more.
Totally.
One other observation I've had about sort of sensation is, usually if I've slept enough, and I'm actually sleeping well these days with extremely weird dreams, is I wake up refreshed. I wake up optimistic. That doesn't always happen. I can have a good night's sleep and wake up like I still feel a little beat up, right? And that is just a difference that I've noticed, of that I'm just kind of coming to terms with, that our baselines for all of us, even if we feel relatively mentally like strong or okay, are perhaps at times lower than they usually are. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you. That's a lot.
Yeah.
Another thing I wanted to ask you all is, what's one thing you would hope people came away from this episode with, held on to after this?
That's a really good question. Do you have one, Anne?
I have a couple things.
Yeah.
At the very beginning of the episode, both Kateri and I dispel some of the myths of how actors use real aspects of their life to build character. And we talk about how we discourage people from using certain memories or circumstances or relationships, that when you are remembering them or reusing them, that they just don't feel good. Like it really hurts, or it opens up trauma, or it just opens up sort of difficult feelings. And I think dispelling that myth is something I was really proud of, and hope that sort of educates people that acting is healthier. Like I think that is actually one of my main goals of this podcast. It's like, acting's a really healthy process, guys. Like you have to be a relatively healthy person to work on it. I also think our conversation, and especially with Gareth, of like the marriage of fact and fiction is really interesting, that you do pull these facts from your life, but then you have permission to fictionalize them very quickly. And that both of those can coexist in the same world is something that's exciting for me.
I think those were the really big ones. I think for me, whenever we're recording, I always imagine that our audience is either a sort of kind of generalist, sort of just interested person, an alum, or, someone who kind of misses being in school, who might not actually have a particular background in acting or theater. Or I also sometimes imagine that our audience is acting students, like maybe high school or, college age, or maybe just graduated, like acting students. I typically don't imagine that the audience is psychologists, just because some of the stuff I'm explaining is sort of maybe not like, psychology 1001, like basic psychology, but it's just not like super controversial, like cutting edge, research. It's just sort of like a summary of sort of generally agreed upon concepts. But I do think that I would point psychologists to listen to this episode to say, we should be paying attention to the kinds of things that like acting teachers are doing, to the kind of thing acting students are doing, because there's a lot of like truth in how memory works and how the brain works that good acting teachers have already figured out, right? Like a lot of the best practices like correspond. And so there is something to the wisdom of exploring things in a non-scientific way, right? Like psychologists sometimes get a little bit, dare I say, defensive, because for so long we were not a scientific endeavor, right? Like psychology used to be indistinguishable from philosophy, and it used to be all about just like thinking about how people probably did things. And then there was like a turn in the 1900s to be like, no, we're a science, we're going to collect objective facts and we're going to have them be testable and all that. And so like a lot of psychologists today, myself inclusive, are really like, no, I'm a scientist. I collect data. I like, I perform studies. I discover truths about the world. But there's other ways to discover truths about the world aside from like objective data. And I think that actors and acting teachers is one of those pathways where like, because they need to discover how to do these things well for their art, they've stumbled upon some of the same solutions that it's taken psychologists like decades to tinker away in their lab to be like, yes, this is a good way to do that.
Yeah. No, and I think, oh my gosh, can I add to that, Evan? Is that allowed?
Yeah, go for it.
So there's this lovely social worker, Professor Kim Bender at DU, who we were mom friends at Fisher Early Learning Center on the DU campus. And she was like, she spends a lot of time using her like social work tools, I don't know what those are, to help human beings like have healthier, better, safer lives. And then she's like, I went to see Kinky Boots at the theater at the Denver Center, the Buell Theater, which brings in all this stuff from Broadway. And she's like, there's like 2,500, 3,000 people in the audience who are like, yay. And I forget, are there drag queens? And then like, is there like a conservative dude who runs a shoe store? And then there's drag queens and then they become friends or something?
Sure. That's like a B+ summary of Kinky Boots.
I haven't seen it, but she's like, here's like a standing ovation. Here's 3,000 people supporting this story that I'm using my like scientific tools to do and also succeeding. But she just was struck by how powerfully the fiction of the story could help sort of real life situations.
Yeah. I think that's totally like that. To me, that's one of the big differences between theater and psychology is like the power of having a narrative and telling that narrative in a really engaging way. I think you could get a bunch of psychologists, sociologists, politicians, like whatever in a room to say, how do we want to instill this belief in the population, right? Oh my gosh, like social psychologists would drool over this assignment, right? Like how do we change people's beliefs about X, Y, Z? And I think that you can use all of the data you want and use all of the like, tricks that people have discovered from social psychology studies. But if someone can write a good play about it that becomes a hit that people go to see, that does your work so much faster and in so much more of an enjoyable way. And people don't know they're being influenced, right? Like they're just going to enjoy their night at Hamilton or whatever it is that they're seeing.
And that circle in Hamilton's actually a really good example because so much of it is rooted in fact, but then of course, like the actors who are playing these roles and how they obviously look very different from the forefathers and the music, like it's this beautiful marriage of fact and fiction. Oh God, that got me thinking. I think okay. Going back to what we were saying about like plays written about COVID, there probably are some brilliant playwrights writing brilliant plays right now. But I also would not be surprised if we all need a little more distance before a brilliant playwright is able to write that play. And Tony Kushner talks about that, who wrote Angels in America. And Angels in America is another example because it's about the AIDS crisis. He wrote it came out in the late 80s, so some time had passed since the start of the crisis. But it's also fiction. It's this really cool combination of fact and fiction. And he says, and I can't quote him, but I'll just paraphrase, like you need the fiction in order for the audience to kind of drop into the fact. If it's just fact, it's hard to engage the audience. The final thing I want to say tied to Kateri's, like, sometimes art helps tell the story as well as the data is there's this very briefly a famous voice teacher named Kristen Linklater, and I'm using her technique in my class. And so much of her work, which is on the body, is rooted in images. There's so many images that are not anatomically correct. She might explain the anatomy, but she's like, actually the anatomy gets in the way here. Like, even though the voice like starts here in the throat, we're going to drop it down into the belly because that's actually going to help you breathe more deeply and free your sound. You're like, oh, okay. So the image, the fake image is actually sometimes stronger than the real image.
Great. Yeah. Um, so another question I wanted to ask, and this is more generally, have you found that doing this podcast together has affected your outside life and acting in psychology?
Yeah. I mean, everything about this podcast, knowing Kateri and then thinking and working through the ideas has improved my teaching and improved my acting. And stop. I love hanging out with Kateri. I love bouncing ideas off of each other. I love building an outline. I have no problem generating ideas. I struggle with the structure, which Kateri is better at than I am. There's one more thing I wanted to say that I've forgotten, but I'll remember it again. I love, this is going to sound, I love that we're two women who are doing this, and that we have, that we're just, I don't know, I just love that it's two women who are figuring out this interdisciplinary way of talking about these two things. And then, yeah, I mean, by talking about a topic as much as we do as we build an episode, I then can bring it very confidently into my work as a teacher and as an actor.
Yeah, I echo what Anne said. I actually think, like, as much as it has influenced my scholarship a little bit in terms of like my research and like my work as a psychologist, it's definitely influenced my teaching more. I think both Anne and I now will occasionally assign episodes as like, we'll occasionally assign episodes instead of like, reading chapters or something like that to our various classes, which is really fun. But I actually feel like overall it's impacted my life even more, just because like I also like hanging out with Anne. I find the time we spend together gives me energy rather than takes it away. You know what I mean? Like there's sometimes if you spend all your day in like meetings or things like that, like, you just like lose a little bit of like, video game, like, energy, your bar drops and drops and drops. And like meeting with Anne tends to fill me up, which is really, really nice. Which is in part interpersonal, but it also in part, like, it's exciting to generate these ideas and have that kind of conversation. I think the other thing for me is it makes more public my interest in this. Like I've always been interested in this intersection, but it's never been clear to me whether it's like a hobby, like, am I just like a theater nerd who like also happens to be a psychologist during the day? And it's like, when I added it to my signature line of my email, like, please see like my podcast, like I felt like, okay, like this is now marking for everybody who interacts with me. Like I'm interested in both of these things. And so even though like my, scientific publication record isn't about like psychology and theater the way that some of our guests are, it feels like I've sort of like claimed it as like a part of my professional identity.
I like that. Another question that I had is, what would you say to students who are interested in exploring intersections of fields? What advice would you have for them?
Okay, I'm going to start with this one because I was a double major in biology and theater when I was an undergrad. And so this is like, and then even within psychology, I'm an emotion neuroscientist. And so I'm like, my degrees and my PhDs in cognitive neuroscience, like, I hang out with a lot of social and personality psychologists. Like even within psychologists, I'm kind of like starfished out in like a few different areas. So I think my biggest advice would be, don't worry about not fitting into like a column, like or a box, because there's room in your life to fully identify with one and have a very robust interest in another, right? Like just because you want to be, a history major and a, biology major, whatever, chemistry major, like they don't necessarily detract from one another, and more often than not, they will synergize and they'll inform each other. So I think also like at the student level, like that's what being a student is about. That's one of the benefits of being at someplace like DU that values interdisciplinarity and like liberal arts education. So there's certainly like, if you feel any pressure at all to like narrow down your interest, like that's not a thing yet. Like I just turned 40 and I'm still I'm still in both worlds, and you can excel. I think for a long time I felt guilt, almost like I was stopping myself from excelling in one area because I had this really robust other interest. And finally I'm like, no, it actually like makes me better at the one to have the other interest, and it makes me just more interesting to talk to.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not like always interesting to talk to, but
yeah, I'm thinking again, we actually have two students who this season are working on the podcast, and both are into psych and theater. I know both are theater majors. I think both are psych majors. I'm not 100% positive about that. And so they are examples of this, or the same interdisciplinarity. But I'm thinking back to Kateri's answer to your first question, where she was saying, as she was listening to me give the lecture, she was creating equal signs, where it's like, well, objective for theater is appraisal theory of emotions, or substitution is episodic memory, that there are these cool analogies. And going back to metaphor, where things that seem disparate, if you're thinking or working with them at the same time, you can find cool bridges. So for example, in my movement and voice class, I'm teaching some Linklater is the main voice that I know to teach. And I'm doing some viewpoints in some Suzuki. Suzuki is a lot about activation and tension. And Linklater is all about relaxation. So they're not usually taught at the same time. In fact, Kristen Linklater herself would say they should never not be taught at the same time. But what I'm discovering, and she's right in the sense that like, if so much of her work is like practicing relaxation, and Suzuki's like, no, like tense your lower body, then why should you study these things together? On the other hand, I am doing it, and I am discovering these amazing similarities, so that if you take this idea that an actor wants to move from their sort of center of the body out to create this like integrated body, both of them are talking about that in their own way. And so it drives home to the student this very important idea from two very different perspectives.
Great. Yeah. So you mentioned the students who are working with you, and I saw on your Facebook that you had introduced them both. But I wanted to ask, what impact has including them in this project had for you?
Kateri, you want to go?
Oh, sorry. My
That's
thoughts
okay.
aren't organized yet. You can go first.
I can jump in. I mean, first, it's a selfish, flattering feeling of like, oh, they want to work on this thing I'm working on. And I have in the past worked with students on particular projects. I took a bunch of students 5 years ago to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, but I don't have a lab. I'm not a scientist with a lab. And so I'm constantly sort of thinking about ways to how can I involve, and I should say there's other examples. I have a theater company where students would work as stage manager and designer. So there are multiple examples, but I don't feel like I have an abundance of examples of bringing students into my work. So I'm always happy for more. And they're thinking about the success of the podcast in ways that are different than mine. Like I am mostly, 80% of my energy is on the content and getting out the content. And Cami is, both of them, but it's mostly Cami's job, is really good at marketing it and getting the word out on social media in ways that I wouldn't be clever enough or young enough to think about. And Nate is deeply passionate about the interdisciplinarity between psych and theater, and interviewed me and another colleague on like a project about this particular type of interdisciplinarity. So he's kind of thinking deeply about it, and he's editing. And so he is kind of our first listener, along with our amazing sound engineer, Jonathan Howard. So it's great. And I'm hoping we're giving them a good experience. I'm glad we can compensate them, but it's definitely been a positive experience.
Yeah, it's been nice to just sort of like grow the family a little bit, like have a slightly bigger team. It makes it feel like a little bit more of a like project rather than just a duo. And the biggest thing I was going to say, but you put good words to it, Anne, was it's interesting having a particular face of like our first listener, like as we're recording, rather than less amorphous, like some people who might discover our podcast somewhere, or like, the handful of people who we could name off the top of our heads who we know are regular listeners. Like as I'm recording, I'm like, is this clear enough for Nate?
Yeah.
So like, and communicating in any sort, a lot of times people talk about audience when you talk about writing, but like the more specific your audience is, like the clearer you communicate. And so hopefully our other listeners are similar enough to Nate that like as we're shooting to make it comprehensible for him, that everyone else will go along for the ride.
Yeah. And I want our listenership to be diverse, and I think it's relatively diverse. I do think the most focused demographic are acting students. I don't know about high school, definitely college, and definitely people in their 20s, like former students and alums of DU who are in their 20s, who are continuing to be creative, maybe as actors, and who are hungry to kind of be in school again. So it has that audience, definitely.
So we're getting a little bit close to the end, so I wanted to make sure I got this question in. Obviously now is a really great time for people to start listening to you because your third season is coming out, I believe, May 12th.
Yes.
Yes. So I wanted to ask, what are you most excited about for season 3?
There's always huge relief when I'm like, we've almost produced it all. Like we're almost there, because it is hours and hours and hours of work. God, Kateri, do you know how to answer? I
mean, I'm always excited for it. I'm proud, like I said before, that we were able to pull off this sort of pivot, and again, produce an episode that's going to be at least relatively timely, because that doesn't always happen. But the first thing that came to mind when you said like virtually is one of our episodes is on creativity. And we haven't even finished like editing it completely yet, but I have a feeling it's going to be really, like, I think it's going to end up being one of my favorite episodes across all the seasons, just because it's such an interesting topic. And like, it doesn't, sometimes our episodes are really focused on things that are very acting specific. It wouldn't apply to like a painter or a writer or other types of artists, but the creativity one totally does.
Oh, I love that. And I think I love that, because I, in a way, feel the opposite, which is when we do one of these more umbrella, these bigger topics, like our objective or substitution are relatively specific, but creativity is so broad. I get nervous that we won't be specific enough inside of it. I do think we are in this one. So I'm excited. I feel like season 1 was like relatively specific. And now sort of in season 3, we have these just cool sort of broad topics that we get to talk specifically inside of. I'm excited about episode 2, which is on emotion, which we've talked about in several episodes, but it's Kateri's expertise, and it's a thing that I obsessively think about and wonder how actors can play such a vague thing. And so I think we kind of deep dive in, I think, successful ways in that particular episode as well. And our final one is on mental health, but a very specific take of mental health. So please listen.
Great, yeah. So we have a couple more minutes. One thing I did want to ask as well is, how are you connecting to the DU community right now?
I get to teach 2 classes. So I see students 4 days a week, and I have a really nice number of students. I have 12 and 13 in those classes respectively, and they keep me going, like seeing their faces on Zoom and getting them to do goofy warm-up games and movement and voice exercises, and then seeing their creative work is extremely satisfying and invigorating. I also am strangely grateful. I was going to say I'm grateful for faculty meetings. Though I'm not grateful for faculty meetings, I am happy to see my colleagues, because I feel like the theater department has a strong community. And so to be able to kind of touch base and lay eyes on my colleagues, I find comforting. And then lately I've been talking to Kateri a lot too, which is quite nice.
Yeah, my first gut response to that is I actually don't feel like it's a problem to connect to the DU community, because if anything, I feel like I have more meetings and emails, and just like, I think people are kind of being overly communicative, which I'd rather be over than under, but like, I haven't felt the need to strategize to connect more. I'll just say that. But I will, this is so cheesy, but like, my Zoom background is DU for 2 reasons. One is because I'm in a very messy loft area of my house that has like the piano and like the yoga mat and the bike and like everything. But also, I really specifically chose this one because I really miss being on campus in the spring. I'm like a total nerd about colleges and universities. Like I grew up in that family where like when we went on road trips, my dad was like, and we need to stop at Duke because we're going, it's a really famous college. And I just thought that like all families went on like college tours for fun, like recreationally. So, so I feel like one of the things I'm really grateful for frequently in my non-COVID life is to be able to walk around campus, to go to places to work on a campus. I like that's one of the quickest triggers for me to be like, I can't believe I have this job. I can't believe this is where I work. And so I purposely put this up to be like campus in the spring. It's like a beautiful place where we all get to be, even though we don't get to be there right now.
Yeah, and we in the theater department do feel like everyone in the dean's office is rallying for faculty and staff, and we got to see Danny and Ingrid briefly during a faculty meeting, which was awesome. Quick sidebar, Kateri, I do think we heard it's not messy in your loft space after you said that.
So we got through most of my important questions. I wanted to see if there was anything else that you two wanted to add.
I just, going back to the, like, I don't always want to feel grateful. I do, Evan, feel very grateful for this hour with you. I thank you for, I guess, caring enough about this product that we've made to spend an hour with us. Any help we can get in spreading the word about the podcast makes me happy and appreciative. And I'm feeling especially excited about this thing that I made with Kateri, because we've been doing a fair amount of work on it the past few weeks to get the word out, or not to get to build it and to complete the content. So I'm just feeling appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you.
I can't add anything to that. I ditto all of that. Yeah, thank you for, I think also thanks for being creative and pivoting like all of your efforts to things that are possible to do remotely. So I think I'm consistently inspired by DU faculty and staff and students who are coming up with new ways to do things that they wouldn't have thought of, 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago. So this is one of those things.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.